Testing, testing. Okay, folks, I think we'll get started. If you want to take your seats. Okay, my name's Craig Knoblock. I'll be your session chair for today. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Marti Hearst, who is a professor in the School of Information at University of California at Berkeley. Professor Hearst did her bachelor's, master's, and PhD work at Berkeley. She's won a number of awards. She's a fellow of the ACM, member of the IJCAI Academy, received an NSF Career Award, an IBM Faculty Award, and an Okinawa Foundation Fellowship. In addition to all their awards, she's done extensive research in this area. So she's been working on interfaces for search engines for a number of years now, information visualization, natural language processing. She has a book out on search user interfaces, she's also the vice president currently of ACL and will become the president. So please welcome me and Marti Hearst.
All right, thank you all for coming to my talk, and thank you to the conference organizers for this invitation. So I'm going to talk about a topic that's an area that I've become really interested in recently. As you heard from the introduction, thank you, Craig, for that wonderful introduction. I'm somewhat of an interdisciplinary scholar. I've been working in a lot of different fields. But what I've become really interested in recently is education. As a professor, of course, all professors are interested in education. We think about it a lot. But there's also been a lot of concern and sort of discussion about artificial intelligence in the news and how it impacts people. And so that's really what I'm thinking about right now with this talk. So I begin with this image to show how many people feel about the rapid changes in automation. There's a combination of thrill and anxiety. Some people feel they cannot keep up and are going over the falls to their destruction. Others are enjoying the ride, but everyone's in the kayak, whether they want to be or not. So here's some advice from Anna Levesque, who was an Olympic bronze medalist in kayaking. Some people want to stick their oar in to slow things down, but to enhance stability in the rapids, it's important to move as fast or faster than the current. Dragging your paddle makes you more vulnerable to flipping over. So people's instinct to deal with technology and automation is probably not going to help them. So my focus in this talk is on two simultaneous disruptions that are related to technology. One is that many people's jobs have changed or will change soon as a direct result of automation, some of it brought on by AI. The second is that much of what many of us in this audience do, teaching and learning, is also undergoing changes. However, to date, that has been less affected by automation and more affected by online access and user interface changes. However, I would argue that they should be benefiting by the mitigating factor of AI more than they are. So these two are not really being combined the way perhaps they should. So we have automation changing jobs or potentially changing jobs, and there's changes going on to teaching and learning. Can the two pull together for better outcomes? And more generally, should AI be improving learning more than it has to date? So my argument is, although for decades technology has been changing the employment landscape, the change seems to be accelerating today. Seems to be, maybe not, but that's what it seems like to a lot of people. One way to address this is to help people help themselves by improving our methods for teaching and learning. We can argue that how we teach and learn hasn't changed much in decades or centuries. One method for improving our teaching and learning is for AI to play a bigger role than it has to date. So this is the outline of my talk. I'm only talking for about 40 minutes, why we need to accelerate learning, Then MOOCs, active learning in the learning sense, not the machine learning sense, and intelligent tutoring systems, opportunities for AI to improve learning tools, and I'll wrap up with caveats, a conundrum, and conclusions. Okay, so why do we need to accelerate learning? Well, a couple weeks ago, I was in Vancouver at the ACL conference, the Association for Computational Linguistics, and it's beautiful. And I was walking down the street, going to the fireworks display that they had for Canada Day, actually, and I saw this burger joint called Cali Burger. So in the middle, there are people flipping burgers, but on the right, my attention was caught by a video screen, because there was a video playing, and it was actually a video of a robot. So, of course, I stopped to look at it. And here's a clip. So pretty cool. That's actually a pretty cool robot, and it's also sort of jazzy music. But what was sort of weird was the end, where right here next to all the workers, they were sort of saying, "We're going to replace you, workers." This video was playing right next to the people doing that very job. I mean, it's kind of harsh. And I mean, it could have said something like it's going to enhance these workers' jobs by making it so they don't burn their hands and they can do other tasks, but it didn't say that. It said it was going to replace them. Yeah, so that's sort of the messaging that's going on right now. So we see a lot of this in the popular press. So Harvard Business Review, meet your new employee. Forum, humans are underrated. Well, when you have to say your own species is underrated, you know you're apologizing for something. And so on. New York Times, The Economist writes a lot about this, about how finance people might be replaced by AI algorithms. Dave Brancaccio on robot-proof jobs, what jobs are robot-proof. And even the Chronicle of Higher Education, people that talk about what professors do is saying we have to figure out how to robot-proof our students. Okay, so a lot of people are worried. You know, I've been in this field a long time. A lot of us have been in AI a long time, and we've seen the ebbs and flows of these claims, but this seems more intense than anything I remember. So, okay, let's hear what some economist observers are saying. So I want to just take quotes from a couple of books. So these are well-known books. So Brynjolfsson and McAfee are going around. A lot of people are listening to them, talking about what does this mean economically. So from this book, they actually have a plot. Okay, you can see that, good. This is Morris's Social Development Index plotted against all of human history. And this is basically an index of humankind's ability to master its physical and intellectual environment in order to get things done. And as you can see, things are basically kind of flat and nothing really happens until the Industrial Revolution, and then there's this enormous exponential jump. And this actually mirrors the population as well. So what their point is that, relatively speaking, not much changed until until machines replaced muscle. So it was relatively stable until the Industrial Revolution. And what they ask is, will simulating the brain power be as big a revolution as simulating muscle power? Are we going to see something even more, some bigger doubling of this curve, for example? Tom Friedman had this book that come out. It was very well reviewed by kind of everyone who reviewed it, called Thank You for Being Late. And I like the sketch. Actually, it's a sketch that Astra Teller made for him. And it's not scientific, but I still think it's evocative, where it's plotting a rate of change against time. And there's a curve of technology and how it's changing things. and human adaptivity and how well humans can react to change. And kind of there's an argument that we're getting better at adapting than we used to be for various reasons, socially and so on. But things are changing so fast now that we're no longer on the curve, that the technology is ahead of people's ability to adapt. So when disruption happens, it happens faster in technology than people's ability to react. So that's a problem because there could be a lot of backlash against technology, for example. So he argues what we need is ways to accelerate how people learn. If we can actually cut this corner, then that could be a good thing. He says there's a mismatch between the pace of change and our ability to develop the learning systems that would enable citizens to get the most out of these accelerations and cushion their worst impacts. So the idea is this should be a good for everyone, but people have to have mechanisms for coping with this change. And he actually, I'm rephrasing here, paraphrasing a little bit here, that we can apply the features that drive technical innovation to figure out how to enhance humans' adaptability. And he talks especially about learning technologies of various sorts, both social technologies as well as technical technologies. In a similar vein, the New York Times has been writing a lot of different articles. This one is about switching careers and talking about how it doesn't have to be hard, how sometimes it's just a matter of shifting what you already know how to do slightly. So this, the gentleman in this photograph is a success story. He used a local training program to switch from operating equipment in the oil field to a high-tech manufacturing job. He needed some very specialized training to make that change, and there happened to be a government program that was just right for him to train him, and now he's got this great job. The problem is such programs are expensive, and they have to be in the right place, and the right person has to be matched with that program. And the New York Times also had this pretty interesting graph where they tried to factor out what sorts of skills are needed for what sorts of jobs, and then in purple are the jobs that are more automatable, and the green are less automatable, and they did a PCA, and they put them on this, 2 dimensions, and sort of said, well, okay, people that have certain sorts of skills maybe are more out of luck because there's sort of a gap here, but people sort of in this area should be able to switch more easily because their skills will transfer. But a role of training can be to just make it easier to, if you have pairwise training from one sort of skilled sort of job to another, that would be a good thing. And The Economist every year has been having these future of learning special issues, and they also have been calling for innovation in education, saying, as technology changes the skills needed for each profession, workers will have to adjust. That will mean making education and training flexible enough to teach new skills quickly and efficiently. AI itself may help by personalizing learning and identifying workers' skills, gaps, and opportunities for retraining. The economists constantly are saying AI is going to do this. I hear that a lot more than I hear it from AI people. This is an issue for knowledge workers too. So I'd like you to think about, what is the half-life of the latest programming tool you yourself used? For me, it feels like every time I learn a new tool, I have to learn a new one, and it takes a lot of time to learn something. Wouldn't you love a way to accelerate your learning? I mean, we've all been learning the same way for decades, if not centuries. What if we really got serious about trying to find a new way to learn that made us faster? So that's kind of what I'm trying to talk about here, and maybe, I think if we did have a new science or technology of learning, it's going to take a lot of different angles. It's not just AI. It'll be a lot of things that are necessary, but what role might AI have in that vision? That's my question for this audience. Okay, so back to my outline. I've talked about why we need to accelerate learning, and now I want to talk about the technologies that are related to what's going on with automation and learning. So let's talk about online learning a bit and what's going on with that. So online learning is very popular right now. So here's some statistics from 2015 on how many people are taking MOOCs. It's even more today. It's still accelerating, massive open online courses. There's a new Chinese platform, and there are many, many people taking courses there. And these are some statistics from a couple of years ago from Khan Academy, many, many countries, 37 million registered students, and 5 billion problems answered. So, huge numbers. MOOCs today, summarizing what I can tell of sort of the status of things. So despite the classic curve of hype followed by backlash, MOOCs are going strong. Some of the early anticipated disruption has faded. They haven't replaced universities, although I don't think the people who started MOOCs thought that was what was going to happen. But other disruptions have happened and will continue far into the future, such as being able to take classes from remote locations, time shifting, and so on. Of relevance to this talk, though, is the disruption in how teaching and learning themselves take place in these computer-mediated courses, and that's the really interesting part from my perspective here. And one key is the emphasis on what is called active learning. And again, I don't mean this in the machine learning sense, I mean it in the learning science sense, which I will explain. So, here's a quote from 1890. "A curious peculiarity of our memory is that things are impressed better by active rather than passive repetition." William James. If you don't know who William James was, he was the first educator to offer a psychology course in the United States, famous Harvard psychologist. Here's a picture of him. And so, and then I'm going to show you a very old psychology study, and we're going to have class participation here with this small class. So say you had to memorize the who's who of this is like an old thing, like who's who of New York City or whatever. This was an active learning study done in 1917. So you had to memorize that text. How best to memorize a text like this in 30 minutes? Here's your question. What % of time should a student spend reading and studying that text, and what % of time should they spend practicing and reciting from memory? So just saying out loud what the text is. All right, so I'm going to give you a choice. So should it be all of the time reading and studying, so 100%, 0%, or should it be 1/3, 2/3, 2/3, 1/3, or 0, 100%? Okay, everyone got that? So how many people think it's 100, 0? Raise your hand. How many people think it's 1/3, 2/3? Okay, how many think it's 2/3, 1/3? How many think it's 0, 100? Okay, so in this particular study, they found 1/3, 2/3. So it's better to practice, spend as much time practicing as possible. And probably you got the answer from what I'd said before. That's just one study. With learning, we have to do lots and lots of different studies with different populations and so on. But the point is, being active, actively engaging, and anticipating and thinking is, and reciting and other interacts with memory is what is meant by active learning. Here's a result from another paper. This is actually studying MOOCs. With MOOCs, people watch videos and they do exercises and other activities. And this was by Ken Koediger's team. And they found that people that just watched videos versus those that did a lot of the activities, the ones who did the activities did much better in the end, or those that did both did much better than those who just watched videos. All right. So I need to introduce a notion here, which is called the effect size, which is a standard measurement used in education research. This is defined in different ways, but roughly when you're comparing before and after of an intervention or for a randomized controlled study, you basically compare the score for a mean of an experimental group minus the mean of the control group divided by the standard deviation, and it depends if the standard deviation is of the pooled results or of the control group. And this is important because what the goal is to get better scores for the experimental group. And Benjamin Bloom, in a very famous couple of papers, popularized the notion of 2 sigma, where he claimed with some tutors plus active learning that he found 2 sigma improvement over a standard style of teaching. So the 2 sigma improvement is sort of the moonshot goal for learning effects for studies, and it's basically almost impossible to get that today. All right. Another concept related to active learning is mastery learning. Mastery learning has been popularized quite a bit by Saul Kahn of Khan Academy, which he kind of talks about the Swiss cheese model of learning. But the main idea is you don't learn something, if you do mastery learning, you learn something thoroughly before moving on. If there's holes in it, you can't move on. You can't build on a weak foundation. Or I say it's like learning to ride a bike without getting balance. You can't ride the bike till you've got balancing done. And when we move students on, when they've only partially learned a concept, say in math, they end up down the line really failing at math farther down. Mastery for learning requires feedback and practice, requires active learning, requires sometimes lots and lots of practice. But you don't want to do the wrong kind of practice. So the problem is if you have students do lots and lots of drills and lots of practice, it can become tedious, it can become a waste of time. And I'm going to talk about the zone of proximal development as a way to try to reduce that practice to just what's needed. Okay, so in Khan Academy, I don't know how familiar you all are with it, but it's very popular, a lot of people know about it. So they'll have a lesson like the laws of thermodynamics. They'll have lots of different lessons within that. They'll have the famous videos, many of them by Saul Kahn himself in his mesmerizing voice. And then they'll have exercises, and in this case, this is a quiz with questions, multiple choice, and then you can see in the corner here, if you get it wrong, which I deliberately got wrong because I'm sure I knew the right answer, then it says, oh, give it another shot, but you can also request a hint, or you can skip for now, you can get more reading. So this is sort of the essence of what happens with tutoring systems, where there's an interactive feedback loops. There's typically an inner loop where there's support during problem work of prompting and hints. And then there's, in the really intelligent tutoring systems, there's an outer loop where there's end of problem support, appropriate feedback on student solutions, appropriate new problems, readings, kind of a lesson plan for the student. And Khan Academy has developed some of this. They call it missions. It seems, I think they maybe only have it in math, maybe they have it in other lessons, I'm not sure. All right, so where does all this stuff come from for Khan Academy? Here they had a blog post about 100,000 practice problems. Well, basically lots of people writing problems and figuring out manually what problems they should write. So a lot of manual work. Okay, so now there's a whole field of AI in education and the field of intelligent tutoring going back to the 60s, or you can argue even farther back. And I don't claim to be an expert in this area. I've been reading up on it, but I'm not expert. But there's some amazing, sophisticated systems that have been developed. Some prominent examples are the cognitive tutor. This is a screenshot from the algebra version. There's geometry and a few others. And auto tutor that actually has a dialogue system, and it will talk to you, have feedback, discussions, and conversations. All right, so do these work? So there are many, many meta-analyses of these systems, and then there's meta-analyses, which is what you have to do with these studies. And so I read what I could find of the latest meta-analysis from 2016. And of course, it depends which studies you look at and that you include. So they took into account important controlling factors and so on. And basically what we find in these are moderately strong positive effects. So a weak effect is 0.2. Remember I talked about these effect sizes. 0.4 to 0.6 is a typical kind of moderately, medium effect. And one of the things that I took note of in their meta-analysis is an important mitigating factor was the adequacy of the program implementation. In other words, if it was a good tutoring system, it worked well, and if it wasn't, it didn't work well. These authors conclude, the evaluations show that ITSs typically raise student performance well beyond the level of conventional classes and even beyond the level achieved by students who receive instruction from human tutors. So they get moderate improvements. Of course, they're very, okay. So why aren't intelligent tutoring systems deployed everywhere for everything? So rather than have me answer it, since I'm not in this field, I'm taking another prominent researcher from the area, Ryan Baker, one of the more prominent researchers in the area, and I think it's a well-known paper that he wrote very recently called Stupid Tutoring Systems, Intelligent Humans, tongue-in-cheek name. He writes, the initial vision for intelligent tutoring systems involved powerful systems that would leverage rich user models to create complex learning interactions. But the intelligent tutoring systems being used at scale today are much simpler. Perhaps we do not, in fact, need intelligent tutoring systems. Perhaps instead what we are already developing, is stupid tutoring systems, tutors that do not themselves behave very intelligently, but tutors that are designed intelligently and that leverage human intelligence. And he's referring in part to another very well-known system called Assistments, which is one of the more heavily used ones in the field, which is very similar, my understanding, is very similar to the Khan Academy version that I showed you. And this is a paper which what it did was it reduced authoring of 1 hour of content from 200 hours to 40 hours. All right. So I think the issue is that it just takes too long to build these things. I think that's why we're not using them. It's just they're hard to create. Also, the tutoring systems that I showed you are currently using the previous generation of technology, and they could, I think, be rebuilt with the latest technology and maybe be a little less brittle than they are, because they're rule-based and so on. All right, and to underscore why we need to make systems easier to build, I'm going to show more people doing this stuff by hand. Linking back to the MOOC discussion, here I have 3 scholars from different fields, physics, AI, and bioinformatics. So these are all STEM fields, and so these are fields where we want to teach difficult concepts. All of them have said the conventional lecture is dead. They're well known for saying this. So Eric Mazur kind of led the charge with his Harvard physics class. He's famously quoted going around giving talks saying, I've been teaching physics at Harvard for umpty-ump years, and my students still leave with their naive model of physics. I have to completely change how I'm teaching. And he converted, he's the one who really popularized this flipped classroom idea, and he completely changed how he was teaching and did active learning in large and small classrooms. Then Peter, as I think a lot of you know, is an AI person and did this artificial intelligence MOOC with Sebastian Thrum, and this is obviously his book, but he said when he was doing the latest version of the book with Stuart, he wrote all this code to make these diagrams, and then he had to turn it into a flat piece of paper, and that seemed like a real waste, and that he was really dissatisfied with the paper version of his textbook. He wanted to bring it to life, and that in part is what inspired the MOOC that he did. And he then also just made these really adorable kind of handwritten exercises. And so partly what they innovated with the MOOC was very short videos followed by exercises to test understanding immediately. So an active learning approach to an online course. But that's all it basically was, is just quizzes. Or if you write a program, there wasn't really a way to check it. I just learned about, at a NSF workshop last week, Pavel Pevsner, who is in bioinformatics, who just won the bioinformatician of, like a sort of a Lifetime Achievement Award. And he gave a talk, a keynote talk, and said, one-on-one education is best, but we can't afford it, and if we could, maybe there aren't enough tutors. Instead, we should combine computers with teaching. He also said, I'm quoting him, or paraphrasing, I have written 3 textbooks, hundreds of classes use them. They're all terrible, don't ever use them. You shouldn't teach this way. Instead, you should use what I'm doing now, which is a massive adaptive interactive textbook. It's not really a book, it's this online thing. It's an online bioinformatics platform. It's designed to be used with a MOOC. There's more than 100 auto-graded programming challenges. There's stop and think exercises, code challenges, detours everywhere. As soon as the student fails, they're directed to a new module to address the learning breakdown. And he says, I don't lecture, I never lecture, and this MAIT mate is a better teacher than I am because it has so much knowledge built into it. And he has these diagrams, like this is just like one path at the start through, and there's these questions, and there's exercises and patterns and things, but then as soon as a student makes an error, they're directed to a sub-branch to address the relevant misunderstanding, and you can see there's FAQs and coding challenges, and then there's sub-branches on the sub-branches. And they have thousands of students taking the course, and they basically study every mistake the student makes in discussions on the forums and look at the long tail of errors. And they have more than a dozen people working on this and have spent more than 7,000 hours developing it already, manually. And here's another example, a developing country's perspective. Karthik Muralidharan, he's an economist, actually, working with computational people that have put together a system called MindSpark. And so wrapping up a lot of research, hardware-focused interventions for homework school have no positive impact on learning outcomes. Pedagogy-focused computer-aided learning have very small learning effects, 0.1 or 0.2. But interventions that deliver the largest gains are those that use technology to personalize instruction, these active learning and personalized ones. So he studied this MindSpark deployment in India with 10 years of development, 45,000 test questions. They have math and Hindi, 1 million questions administered per day. So they have a lot of data. They can tailor the suggestions to the students. And they, again, manually analyze student errors to refine suggestions to build into this system. So this allows for identification of long tail misconceptions. And here they get a 0.36 learning gain in math and 0.22 in Hindi. But part of what's important is they have students from different social backgrounds, and so it's quite a success story. But it's all done manually. Here's some pretty amazing examples of long tail error misperceptions, not errors. So the students are supposed to say which number is larger, 3.27 or 3.3. And in this case, they say 3.27 is larger because 0.27 is larger than because 27 is larger than 3. So they're misunderstanding the decimal place. Here's a case where they say it's larger because somewhere some teacher said think of it as a reciprocal. So they're saying 1 over 27 is larger than 1 over 39. So it's a very small percent of the students, but there's a lot of students. So this is something that you could have a model of how people think about numbers, but it takes a lot of creativity to have ever thought of this. It's probably not in your model. So, and there's many more examples of professors or instructors doing this all over the place. So my claim is, if there were an easy-to-use, semi-automated way to develop these systems, people would use it. Why don't we have good software for developing auto-graders, question suggesters, and so on? Think about it. All right. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about opportunities for AI to improve learning tools. So I don't have the answer. I don't have the answers. But I'll talk about a few ideas that have caught my eye from other people, and a little bit of some stuff I did. So I'll talk about two directions. These are two kinds of interventions for which many studies have shown at least medium, moderate learning gains. One is to aim for the zone of proximal development, and the other is to use peer learning. So what's the zone of proximal development? That's this notion introduced by Lev Vygotsky, a very famous learning scientist, which is students would be in a state where there's concepts that they can, or problems they can do unaided, and there's problems that are just too difficult for where they currently are. And what you want to do is offer them problems that are in the zone in between. So you want to give students the hardest tasks they can do at a given point. And if you do that, that can lead to learning gains, it's been found. So if you suggest steps in the zone that can make active learning more efficient and effective, rather than things that are too hard or too easy. So there's some interesting ideas out there that I've come across. So here's one by Betst Yüksel, which is to detect cognitive load automatically and then dynamically adjust problem difficulty based on that. So she has this cool system called Bach, which she used it for music teaching, where she has a notion of easy versus hard musical pieces to play. And then she models high versus low cognitive workload by using this device to measure externally with people. And then in real time, adapt the difficulty and see how people respond to that. And they found both increased accuracy and playing speed. And using this functional near infrared spectroscopy technology that just lets you strap something on a person's forehead and then kind of shines a beam through the curved part of the forehead, as she explained. So I have just a 1-minute video explaining how this works.
BAR, or Brain Automated Chorales, is an adaptive musical learning system based on brain sensing that helps piano players learn Bach chorales. BAR uses functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or FNIRS, which has been demonstrated by IJCAI researchers to measure user cognitive workload. In this paper, participants were presented with varying difficulty levels of a Bach chorale. Using BAR, we measure the cognitive workload of participants to determine when they could cognitively handle a higher difficulty level. BAR increased the difficulty level of the musical pieces as learners' cognitive workload fell below a certain threshold, indicating that the learner could handle more information. Each level added a full line of music. Participants were given 15 minutes to learn a piece with BAR and 15 minutes to learn a piece the way they normally would in a control condition. They played the pieces once all the way through at the end of the practice session. This final performance was recorded and analyzed for accuracy and speed. Performance data showed that participants played with increased speed and accuracy when they learned with BAR. Furthermore, participants said that they felt that they played better and learned more easily with BAR.
So that's pretty cool. So this is an example of using technology to help detect when students are in the zone of proximal development. And this is just one example of an active field of sensing, brain sensing the technology and so on, but applying it to learning. Another piece of work that I really like is by Eric Anderson at Cornell. And this is more of a knowledge representation idea. So the problem is that the state of the art for suggesting next questions usually represents knowledge along only one dimension. So he has a solution which is a more expressive yet still simple representation based on partial order graphs. And the advantages are it can richly represent the zone of proximal development and can compare learning strategies of different kinds. So here's the idea. So say we have a way of representing something really simple like addition, because we want to compare strategies for teaching addition. So for example, if A is 1-bit addition without a carry, B is 1-bit addition with a carry, C is writing a carry, then 15, the standard way of teaching 15 plus 18, at least in the West, would have these 3 operations, and the way of adding 93 plus 15 would have these operations. And there's other ways of teaching addition, actually, it turns out. What you can do with this sort of representation is if you just say having more operations means it's a harder task, if you take that sort of simple view, then we can express the difficulty of different problems. So, for example, if you then give students a series of problems of addition, then, so here, this is from a particular textbook. The green is meant to be beginner questions, and these were shorter. They didn't take that many operations. And blue is meant to be advanced, and sure enough, they take more operations. And the number here is the order in which the question was presented. And this can actually show gaps as well as unintended ordering problems, as shown here. Because here we can also compare 2 different textbooks sequences. So if you can see there's blue versus green, we can see that the green quickly reaches more difficult problems than the blue, which wasn't intended, because actually they wanted to have simpler questions first and then more difficult ones. But because the textbook makers hadn't considered the operations that the students had to make, they failed to achieve their goal of simpler before harder. Okay, so what if we wanted to have more complex representation than just this univariate thing? So for example, teaching second language learning, he comes up with this representation here of templates. So rather than learning one word at a time, he has this notion of a template. So this is learning Japanese, a template of sort of a dash and this symbol for this pattern. And this template here, these two symbols for this pattern, and this repeating template for this pattern. So in this formulation, S2 is harder than S1 since it has two distinct templates. And S3 is harder than S1, but easier than S2 since the templates repeat. So you want to actually represent a richer relationship between the problems. And so his idea is to make a partial ordering over these representations. And when you do that, then you get this really nice notion of a knowledge boundary, where the green represents the concepts that the student has already learned, and the red ones are the concepts the student hasn't learned, and you have a boundary between these. And then you can represent the zone of proximal development this way, where the things really close to the boundary are in the zone. So these are the things that they haven't quite learned but maybe are ready, and these are things that are too easy. So it's a nice representation, and you can then control distance from the zone, but for a richer, more complex thing like learning a foreign language. And so actually they tested this with a bunch of people learning Japanese, and they tested it by asking learners if they understood each sentence, and then marked the partial ordering accordingly, and then gave them sentences to learn. And they were able to predict learners' perceptions of difficulty without data, just based on this model. So that's pretty exciting. And then they were also able to compare another thing you have to worry about when doing this sort of thing is you don't just show problems one time or concepts one time. There's a whole set of questions around, do you reinforce, when you first introduce a concept, how often do you reinforce it? When do you reinforce it? Do you have other problems in between? And then do you recombine concepts together? And so he was able to compare different textbooks and see how similar or different they were based on this representation. Another idea is word problems. So this is related to, but it's kind of a game. I didn't want to leave out games. So work by Polozov et al. Took the typical boring word games like Susie is 10 years older than Billy, and next year she will be twice as old as Billy, etc. And convert this into stories, or facsimiles of stories. So it becomes much more exciting when you use the children's names in the stories. Like, Knight Alice has 30 chalices, Dragon Elliot has 9. Alice slays the dragon and takes the chalices. How many chalices does she have now? In this work, you can allow for mastery by making these engaging word problems as games that they're not technically connected together, but they sort of feel like they are, and using natural language processing, discourse tropes, and co-reference resolution. Many students find these very engaging and do enough word problems to achieve mastery. All right. The other thing I want to talk briefly about is peer learning. So this is another area which is learning with other students. So hundreds of research papers show the value of peer learning. There's a lot of reasons for it. Peer learning is students talking to each other about problems. Peers remember what it's like to not understand something. Once we know a concept well, we forget what it was like not to know it, and we forget how to talk about it in a naive way. Also, the way to really learn something is to teach it to someone else. It makes you understand what you don't know. It's well understood. So in a large lecture forum like this, most people are too intimidated to speak out. So blue represents there's the instructor and a few brave souls who are willing to talk in front of a crowd. And so peers don't get to talk, don't get to exercise the benefits of peer instruction. But if you require students to talk in small groups, like shown here, groups of 3, almost everyone talks, almost everyone benefits. And really in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of work on peer learning and what's called structured peer learning, where it's not just people chatting, but there's really a lot of structure to what the students do in the groups. And there's a lot of clever tricks and so on, not really tricks, but strategies around peer learning. One that really caught my eye was making the students in the small groups responsible for each other's success. And they even had somewhat nasty little tricks, like you're all going to take a quiz, and the lowest score on the quiz goes to everyone in the group, so you all better make sure everyone understands the concepts here. Or maybe they'd average the score or something like that. So I think there's opportunities for AI to better facilitate structured peer learning, but I'll talk about something we did, our MOOC Chat project, where we wanted to see if we could design small group discussions to improve learning online. And so first we did this with crowd workers, and we built a tool where here you see the students were told to discuss a question. We had these pretty difficult questions that you could not look up online the answer to. It required sort of careful reasoning, and so the students would first see the question, they would choose their answer out of a multiple choice, then they would see what the other students chose, and then they had to talk with each other about it, and they had a timer. The trick was that they would get bonus points if all of the students got the right answer. That was the key aspect here, to get them to try to work together to understand the concepts. And so what we found was a higher percent of correct final responses for the workers in these groups of 3, and the bonus incentive improved results. And we would get rich discussions about the questions, like showing here. And we also found an interesting result, which was if at least one person in the group had the answer right, then the group was much more likely to eventually arrive at the right answer, or more people would arrive at the right answer. But the converse wasn't true. So as long as one person was right, they kind of would get to the right place. So, I mean, they tended to. So this was then reproduced by Carl Redsma of the University of Queensland, when you're here. He and his team introduced this into intro engineering course with more than 1,000 students, but this was not fully online. It was a regular class, but there's so many people that they had an online component. And they reproduced our results, finding pre and post chat responses that if at least one was right, then more would get it right, and also that they tended to get things right when they were in the groups versus control when they were alone. And also they found learning gains. So the groups where the team members tried to get understanding, as determined by analyzing their chats, they ended up with better results in a follow-up exam. But if the problems, and if we're outside the zone of proximal development, if the problems were too hard, the chats didn't help. So that was interesting too. It only worked when the problems were within their capability. So one thing that comes of this is, well, what if there isn't anyone in the group that kind of understands the problem well enough? And so here, if these dots are students and the color indicates what answer they chose initially, what if we could online dynamically group the students according to what their answer was? Now, I don't know what the right thing is to do. Should we group everyone who had the same answer, or should we intersperse somebody who has the right answer? Or this is something where we would have to experiment to figure out what the right thing is to do. So peer learning is so powerful, it's been proven so many times that it's powerful. It seems like there's a lot that AI could do to help make sure students have on-topic conversations if they're not doing it, steer conversations if they get off topic, make little hints, et cetera, et cetera. It's a good NLP problem, and so on. Okay. So let me wrap up with some caveats and so on. So my argument has been that although for decades technology has been changing the employment landscape, the change seems to be accelerating today, at least some people think so. One way to address this is to help people help themselves by improving our methods for teaching and learning. And one method might be for AI to play a bigger role than it has to date. And more generally, I think we should have a moonshot to accelerate learning. There just hasn't been enough research into this. How do we get a quantum leap in performance? And can AI be a part of the solution? Another issue is, what do we know about what works? So Ken Koeniger in his Learning at Scale keynote sort of outlined what some of the questions around active learning, when we order these questions, we don't know if you should, how many questions should you have in a row, the numbers, the results conflict with each other, how long should you wait between trials, should you have fully worked out examples or only partially worked out, there's this question about discovery learning, et cetera. There's a lot of debates. And he points out that there's a really big design space. So if you kind of take all the questions that I just listed and then you kind of expand them out and do randomized controlled studies, this is his slide, you get, this incredible, 205 trillion options. He does point out that actually a bunch of them correlate with each other, so it's not really that bad. But he advocates for every school and university should be an education research lab. And he also cites this report from the Global Learning Council saying something as well. And put another way, every course is an opportunity to advance understanding. I mean, what if every time we taught a class we were doing a randomized controlled trial? What if every time we taught anything we were trying to advance our understanding the state of the art of research? Probably we should be doing this. And as well, whenever we develop a class, it would be really great if we had automated tools to help us develop the active learning components instead of doing them manually, which is what I'm doing. So I showed that Dave Brancaccio, robots are taking our jobs image earlier, and this is a quote from that as well. Let's see, now we're looking at what humans can do about it. This was from that piece. There was a quote within that article by Tom Khalil, who is a leading science policy expert and doer. And he says in that article, how could we take advances in AI and reduce the time for a non-college educated worker to gain a skill that is a ticket to the middle class? Government should work with the brightest minds and companies to invest massively in new ways to help workers adapt to a workforce that increasingly includes algorithms and machines doing the work humans used to. And he goes on to point out the difference between the US defense budget of $71 billion and the US labor budget of only $4 billion. And he says that, at least in the US, there should be an ARPA. ARPA is the Advanced Research Projects Agency. So he's saying there should be a whole research agency dedicated to education. And if we had that, and if we had every classroom be an experiment, we actually might be able to make a dent in this question of, how can we do learning differently than we have in the past? It's kind of crazy that we're still doing it the way we've always done it. Now, there's a conundrum, I think, if I were in the audience, I'd be going, well, wait a minute, Marty, you're saying use AI to improve learning, but then aren't you just like automating away another job? But I would say not really, because in all of this, I don't think jobs are disappearing, they're changing, and we're not eliminating. And furthermore, you can't automate these jobs. Learning requires people. There's a willpower, there's encouragement, there's the cohort, there's expert advice. People have to want to learn, and there's always a social and human component. And furthermore, we want to accelerate human learning beyond what's possible today. We just do not know how to reach the 2 sigma goal or anything beyond that as well. Automation and expertise together might be the key, among other things. So learning is the ideal laboratory for core AI problems. I mean, machine learning, knowledge representation, reasoning, natural language processing, image and video analysis, cognition, and all aspects of neuro whatever. So I don't know why everyone isn't working on it. So working together, we might make a difference. And thanks for your attention. I'd love to have a conversation.
Okay, Juan Liu from Arizona State University. I have a question about, it's here, it's in the back. Yeah. And I have a question. It is about, for MOOCs, for example, and the loneliness is a big issue. So is there any large effort to mitigate the loneliness in MOOC study? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And a lot of people are, so MOOCs are often used by really motivated people that are doing sort of advancing their careers, people that already have advanced degrees and so on. So a lot of people actually organize in-person classes around MOOCs. And so this happens with schools, this happens with Khan Academy. There's high schools that actually use the technology from Khan Academy in the classrooms, but people will organize in-person groups and use the technology in person. But it's definitely seen as an issue that, learning is social. It's the way MOOCs are used has shifted from the report I just read. Is they're no longer really massive anymore in terms of lots of people doing them at once. They're kind of on demand. People are either available like every 2-week cycles, and so the forums are usually not as big as they used to be. So the way that they started out is not the way they currently are. But most people are not motivated. That's one reason I had this slide here. Most people are not motivated to learn on their own. They really have to be with other people in order to learn.
Hi, it's Christina Conati from University of British Columbia. Thanks for the great talk. And I especially appreciate this, the fact that you brought the idea that there is a lot that AI can do for human learning. And in fact, there's a community that has been working in applying AI to human learning for many years now. There is a Journal of Artificial Intelligence in Education. There are a couple of conferences. But there is also this trend that was pointed out by the paper that you showed by Ryan Baker, where because it's difficult to build good educational systems that leverage AI, now there's a trend to believe that you can also just settle down with technology-enhanced environments where you have cool technology and it's not necessarily AI-based, and you can still get good results, which to some extent I think is very true. On the other hand, I also believe strongly that, as you were saying, more core AI research can do much more than designing what he called as stupid tutoring systems, but well designed. They have, they definitely have qualities, but I think intelligent tutoring systems that leverage AI techniques can do also a lot. And recent advances in machine learning have generated some new success stories for intelligent tutoring systems, but it's other areas. So, people have referred to tutoring systems as AI complete because so many areas of AI can come into play, as your last slide said. So I think this community should really come together and, as you were saying, push towards creating better learning and accelerated learning and higher quality learning. So.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, Ryan Baker's paper was actually in the Journal of AI in Education. So I thought it was very brave of them to publish that paper.
Or if there's time for more questions. So why not just have in MOOCs, sort of to address the loneliness problem, and assuming you have critical mass, why not just make sort of one-on-one or one-on-several sort of interactions or requirement after one student's mastered a sort of certain technique, teach it to a few other people that are still learning it? That would probably address some of the sort of problems.
That's a nice idea, but there's a lot of issues. So first of all, when someone's mastered something, they tend to want to move on to the next thing. And when they're still learning it, it's having peers teach each other. The official teaching is, peer learning is more about muddling it through together, but you don't necessarily know the answer, but it helps you to get to learning. But as the instructor, it takes a lot more experience to actually be an instructor. So it doesn't necessarily work for peers to be instructors. There's a huge synchronicity issue with MOOCs. So we try to have MOOC Chat, our system, dynamically group groups of 3 people together, and you really can't get groups of 3 very easily. It's a major scheduling thing. People have to commit in their schedule to do that. So there's something called I forgot the name of it, but there are tools that let people schedule like Google Hangouts or whatever so that they can chat together. But it's actually a pretty major undertaking since these tend to be global and people are sort of doing their own thing. It's much better. That's where formal classes actually have an advantage because people have made a commitment to be somewhere at a given time. So it has to probably be asynchronous when it's the more informal setup, unless people have committed to being at a certain place or a certain time, not a certain place, certain virtual place. Yeah.
Thanks.